Welcome everyone to the This Week I'm Into podcast, and this week I'm into fermentation. I'm your co-host Pete Tyler. Later on in the episode, we're going to have Paul's friend Ryder Sadler join us to talk about his passion of fermentation. But right now I'm with my friend and co-host Paul Imbragulio. Paul, how are you doing?
I'm having a hard time breathing, Hans. There's not enough oxygen in this room.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. You're freaking on top of it.
I am, but don't call a doctor. I'm actually okay.
All right, Paul, let me set the scene for you. You ready for this?
Yeah. Am I a little microbe?
You're a little microbe. You're hanging out on a kimchi and you're doing your best to ferment. No, in reality, I'm wondering, say you have a friend who's really into fermentation, and this might be really realistic for you.
Yeah.
And they say, Paul, I've been experimenting lately. I've been doing fermentation on all kinds of things. Hey, Paul, would you be willing to try this? They open their hand and they reveal something. Paul, what is the weirdest, most outlandish thing your friend could offer you that you would still be willing to eat? In the palm of their hand, what appears that you're like, okay, I could still do this?
Well, the coolest thing I've ever seen online of someone ferment was early season pine cones.
No way. How does that even work?
Apparently, there's certain pine cones that are edible when they're really small. Not all pine cones, but they're like green and on like certain trees.
Okay.
And they look just like pine cones, and you can ferment them. And
okay.
Yeah, you can eat them.
So you're telling me don't go out to that pine tree outside my window right now and just try to eat a pine cone. You're telling me don't
specifically
do that.
You, Hans, you should do it, but nobody
I can do
else.
it.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here I go. Pine cone chomping.
All right. We'll be right back.
All right. And we're back, and my gums are bloody, and that was a really painful experience, and it didn't taste very good. So maybe it's because it wasn't fermented.
Yeah, that's it. It breaks it down a little bit more.
All right, Paul, that was actually a really good choice because that is out there. I was thinking like, I don't know, kimchi or something, but maybe that's too basic. Like,
here's the thing, Hans. If you opened your hand, it's like that game where it's like, hey, close your eyes and open your hand, right? I'm never going to do it because I know you're going to put something disgusting in my hand. There's never a time where it's not trash.
It will always be trash. Do you know that game where it's like a Halloween thing where like you put something, you know, like you put like wet spaghetti in a box and then you're like trying to guess what it is and you can't see it and they're like, oh, it's like intestines or it's like brain, or you know what I'm talking about?
There's a game like that on like Jimmy Kimmel or Jimmy Fallon or something, one of those late nights.
Anyway, that's a total tangent, but I don't even know how we got there, but that's what I'm thinking about right now.
I'm not sure. You're losing me, man.
Okay, let's bring it back. Let's bring it back in. Paul, can you just explain a little bit about what fermentation actually is?
Sure. So normally, for us air-breathing folk, we need oxygen for our cells to work. I won't go into the whole biology of it because Hans would shame me. But fermentation is basically where something is in an environment without oxygen, hence my original joke.
Mm-hmm.
It's often involved in like breaking down foods. And yeah, that's my general description. Hans, you're a bio guy. You got to have more details.
I absolutely love it, Paul. I'll add maybe a little bit, but yeah, that's the basic gist of it. And I'll try not to get like too nerdy about it, but like you were saying, a lot of times it has to do with like microorganisms, right? They need sugar to create energy, but they don't have oxygen to supplement that process like humans have, right? Or like humans use that kind of mechanism. So these microorganisms they convert sugar into energy, and the byproducts from that process are what we like consider as fermentation. So like we have alcoholic fermentation, right? So you have, bacteria or yeast that use sugars without oxygen, convert it into an energy, and the byproduct is like it's an alcohol, right? So that's how you get, your beer, your wine, your mead. But there's other kinds of fermentation, right? There's lactic acid fermentation, there's acetic acid fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation you'll see with like yogurt or sauerkraut, and then acetic acid fermentation you'd see with like vinegar. So there's a lot of kinds of fermentation, but essentially the gist of it is like microorganism, no oxygen. What byproduct do they make? And then how does that byproduct end up being tasty for us humans? So do you think that's a fair description, Paul?
Yeah, that's way more detailed. Thank you.
Maybe that was actually too much, but look, there's different kinds of fermentation and they make different kinds of products. So yeah. But like fermentation obviously has been used for thousands of years. I think something that I wanted to touch on, and I'm just curious if you heard of this, Paul. Do you know the Greenland shark? Do you know, like, it's like an Icelandic delicacy, fermented Greenland shark?
I don't know the Greenland shark, Hans. What is that?
Okay, so the Greenland shark it's a species of shark, and it's famous for living thousands of years. But it's a delicacy in the sense that, like, you know how, like, surströmming in Sweden is a delicacy? Like, it is a fermented shark meal. So basically what it is this Greenland shark that lives thousands of years. When it dies, you can bury it in the sand. This is all coming from, Viking times. For like 6 to 8, I think it was months. You unbury it, let it dry, and then you can chop up the skin and the meat, and you can actually eat the Greenland shark. And the reason you do it is because if you eat the Greenland shark as it's fresh, it's actually toxic. It can lead to blindness, and if you eat enough, it can even lead to death. But if you let it ferment, then it's actually safe to eat. With that being said, it's like kind of famous as being like, people call it like the stinkiest cheese left in the hottest car. It is rancid smelling and extremely difficult to eat. So I was just curious if you had ever heard of that, because I was like, that is like a classic fermentation story, I feel.
You think I'm just eating disgusting animals. Once I said pine cones, you're like, he probably eats shark.
He knows shark, yeah. But I think it was famous because it was on, do you know No Reservations from Anthony Bourdain? You don't know? No, do you know Anthony Bourdain?
Yeah. Is that, yeah, I mean, I know his travel show. I just don't know if that's what it's called.
Yeah, okay, it's his travel show, right? So
yeah.
He would go to different countries and like try, different kinds of foods. He tried Greenland shark in his second episode ever, and he like famously has said like
this is still a thing.
It's like the worst thing he's ever eaten. Is like what he said. So I was just curious if you ever heard of it. I thought it was anyway. That was a tangent. Greenland shark. Curious if you had ever heard of it, but maybe you should try it sometime. Would you be willing to try it?
No. If Anthony Bourdain says it's the worst thing he's ever tried, it's not about something being edible that makes it worth trying, right? It also has to have some value, and I'm not one who eats something purely on shock value. Like, as long as you try to tell me that it's good, I'll try almost anything.
Yeah.
But if you're just saying it's gross, there's no point.
You're not going to eat it just to say that you've eaten it.
If you say it like smelled bad, right? So like there's this like really famous food in Taiwan called stinky tofu, and I would describe it as literally if you stuck your face in a dumpster. That's what it smells like.
Okay.
But it does taste pretty good. So I'm not going to have a lot of it, but at least I would try it if there was some redeeming value.
That's like the Swiss like raclette, like the stinky cheese. Mm-hmm. I love that cheese, but it like if you have a lot of it in a confined area, like it smells bad. Like it smells pretty pungent. So
yeah,
but it tastes awesome. So I'm definitely on the same page with you there.
Well, speaking of cheese, right? Like the pungent smell, I would imagine is a lot due to like fermentation often seeming like there's a lot of microbes on it. So it's like what we would consider often rancid. But there's certain ones that are non-toxic, which is why we have so much good cheese.
I think it's kind of strange that humans like cheese, but here we are. I mean, I'm one of those humans, so.
Yeah.
Paul, do you have any experience with fermentation? Curious where you go with this.
Yeah, I have a lot.
Okay.
With my horrible description of what it is, most of my life I've worked in labs, like when I still did like lab work, and my first job in manufacturing was all in the fermentation area. I guess what maybe like the most interesting thing in terms of fermentation that I've done is my first job out of college. I worked in a fermentation area that we made drug substance for a vaccine. Mm-hmm. But the way that we did it was that we used yeast, and we literally would grow yeast and we would ferment it. And when we did that, it would cause like the creation of whatever goes into our vaccine, right? But it was really funny because all the steps were exactly the same as you would be making beer, but with like different ratios of like sugars and oxygen and stuff. We were actually trying to avoid fermentation as much as possible because, you know, if you just ferment a big vat of yeast like you do for beer, a lot of the times it dies. Like all the yeast die, which is on purpose because they don't survive in an alcoholic environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so I actually did it for my job, and it was a lot about, I guess, preventing fermentation realistically, but the science was all there.
So you have actually professional experience with fermentation.
Yeah, and even in school too. I took a fermentation design class in like a chemical engineering course.
Oh,
and so
okay.
we worked on like designing like the way that reactors are built in industrial scales. So it's pretty cool. Really I actually really like it. It's a really interesting topic, and obviously I love a lot of the products from fermentation. So it's a cool thing to get into.
Can I take the flip side of that? I don't have professional experience, but I have some recreational experience with fermentation. So one of my COVID projects, and this I feel like is a very standard COVID project, was making my own beer. So I like.
Did you buy a kit, or did you go from?
I bought my own. I bought a kit. Which like made it really easy, like step-by-step instructions, like here's what you have to do. So I made my own beer, let it ferment in my garage for a couple weeks, called it the Hans Lager. I don't know what I did wrong with this beer, but it ended up like being extremely alcoholic. So if anyone's dude, like an ex, I don't know. But like it was maybe not the best, but it actually wasn't terrible. It was drinkable. But it was like I was measuring like the specific gravity of it at the very end, and like the conversion table told me that like my beer was super alcoholic. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. So I don't know what I did wrong. Maybe someone who makes their own beer could chime in or email us at thisweekiminto@gmail.com and tell me what I did wrong that made it so alcoholic. But that was like a COVID project for me for fermentation. I actually had a really good time with it, but clearly I do not have the space in my studio apartment anymore to do a fermentation project. But I think I'll revisit it in the future because I actually did have a really good time with that.
Do you remember what your ABV was by chance?
I think it was around 8%.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. You made like a strong beer. I did.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I was mentioning, right, is we were actually trying to prevent alcohol production in our fermentation to keep the yeast alive, because the reason that you don't have like stronger wines or anything like that than, I don't know, what's like a high wine, like 15% maybe, is because yeast like can't survive in, I think like the general consensus is around like 18 to 20% alcohol. So that's why you'd have to distill anything basically stronger than 18%.
To me, and that makes a lot of sense too, right? Because alcohol is a waste product of yeast. So as it like it's literally getting rid of it, and then it's being forced to live in that same environment. So I think it makes sense that you can't live in your own waste product. I feel like that's a good take-home message.
That's a good take-home message. The only thing I've tried to personally ferment, Hans, is pickles. For that fermentation class I was talking about, one of our like projects was to like actually try to ferment something, so it wasn't all just theoretical. And I actually hate pickles, and hopefully I've made that very clear. I hate them a lot.
Sure.
Anyways, they were really easy to make because all you had to do is get like cucumbers and then put them in kind of like salty water.
Yeah.
And literally the natural bacteria that were on the outside of the cucumbers would cause the fermentation into pickles. Like you can add things, right? And I think like in industrial beer and wine and probably other, and like cheeses and other things, like you add specific bacteria that you want, right? I'm sure they're all like manufactured to be really good at certain things. But, you know, you hear about pickles, you can literally just chuck them in a jar and you can make them yourself. Or like people who make their own sourdough starter, right? A lot of the times, like you don't want to use like those instant yeast packets to start a sourdough. You literally will just like leave your jar outside and just hope that something floats into it.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And I think like you're completely right, because I think historically when beer and winemaking started, like you didn't need to add yeast, specifically for wine, because like grapes have their own microorganisms. So when you squish it, you can let it just ferment on its own. Like you don't need to add a packet of yeast. So like, speaking to your experience with pickles, like, yeah, like fermentation is like a natural thing. Like, it's not something that humans invented, quote unquote. But it kind of makes me think, I have this thought experiment a lot, Paul. Who was the first person to try alcohol and keep drinking it? You know what I'm saying?
Because a long time ago.
It's sour. It like, and I'm sure like if you have an experience like drinking a beer, like the very first time you drink a beer, like I don't think anyone's like, "Ooh, yeah, that's good." Like, so who had that first beer was like, "I should keep going." You know what I'm saying? Yeah. I don't know. Thoughts to ponder. Anyway, Paul, can I hit you with some fun facts?
Some fermentation fun facts. Fun facts with Hans. Fun facts with Hans.
All right, Paul. Did you know that fermented food, aka specifically kimchi, has been brought to space?
No, I did not know that.
So, a Korean astronaut brought kimchi to space because it is a staple of Korean culture, Korean cuisine. So they wanted to bring kimchi up to space with a Korean astronaut. But you can't have active like bacteria fermenting while you're in a space station like that. You just can't have that.
Yeah,
so
freeze dried.
So well, Korean scientists created what's called a space kimchi, so that they were able to bring this cuisine up with them, but it would still be safe to actually transport. And the way they did it is they made the kimchi, put it in a bag, and then put radiation through the bag in order to kill all the bacteria in there so that it was safe to transport.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's awesome, right? The astronaut did say that it did not taste like regular kimchi, but they were happy to have it. So
I feel like that could also be due to the fact that you're in space. Like, I bet it screws with your taste buds. Just like how it, like, in the airplane, right, things taste different. I bet it happens in space, too.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know. Would you be willing to try a radiation kimchi?
That I would.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's switch from astronauts to the California Gold Rush. So, the California Gold Rush, miners were flocking to the city, and they were actually in love with, for whatever reason, sourdough starters. The miners needed a lot of bread to just keep fueled for all this gold rush events. And so the miners would always have a sourdough starter with them. But as you know, in California during nights, it can get a little cold, and sometimes cold enough that it would kill the colonies. So the miners were famous for, they would actually sleep with their sourdough starters in their sleeping bags with them in order to keep it warm enough that the yeast would thrive and survive. And this has become such a known fact and such a staple of the California Gold Rush that currently the professional NFL team, the San Francisco 49ers, their mascot's nickname is officially Sourdough Sam.
What?
Yeah, I didn't know that. Sourdough Sam.
Yeah, I didn't either. That's cool.
The Gold Rushers, they loved their sourdough. Okay, Paul, how much are you willing to pay for a jar of yogurt?
This is going to be a stupid comment. I really like yogurt about 1 week out of the year. And then other than that, it gives me mad ick. Okay. I couldn't even look at it.
It's
just one of those things, like you're just like, oh man, I could try yogurt right now. And you're like, that was pretty good. And then you buy way too much of it, and then you never want to eat it again.
Wow. Okay. I appreciate
So I would pay for one of those like kind of tall ones. I don't know how much that is, like a quart. How much do you buy yogurt? For like a couple bucks, maybe like $4 or $5.
Okay, $4 or $5. What if I told you this yogurt is called Cream Door? It's made in Hokkaido, Japan. It has milk and honey. It's a rich, creamy texture. It is the epitome of a luxury yogurt. It comes in a gift box and it's wrapped in a bow. Now, how much would you pay for it?
Am I paying like $120 for like a spoonful of yogurt?
Well, essentially, but maybe not that much. This lactic, luxury yogurt is $50 a jar.
Hans, can you give me a fun yogurt fact about Idaho?
Absolutely, I can. Thank you for asking. The Chobani factory is in Twin Falls, Idaho. So if you enjoy Chobani yogurt, you can thank Idaho for that. There's other Chobani factories too, but the main one is in Idaho. So just saying.
Thanks, Idaho.
Thanks, Idaho. Anyway, that's all my fun facts. And just in case you want to know, Paul, because I know you like where I get all my fun facts from. This one comes from VermontCreamery.com.
The VermontCreamery.com had the fact about Japan.
Yeah, they love their fermentation fun facts. So
yeah, no, that's great.
That one seems like a more legitimate source than a lot of my previous ones.
Yeah, it did. It had the word creamery in it.
Good.
At least it was on topic.
Anyway, Paul, you want to hit us with any not fun facts, any resources about fermentation?
Yeah, you can basically see how to ferment anything online. And honestly, most of the time, they're pretty simple, like raw materials. So, I would just watch a cool YouTube video about almost anything that you think might be fermented. And I bet you could do it at home. Just make sure before you eat it that you smell it. And if it smells rancid, it might be.
It's
use your senses,
toxic.
ladies and gentlemen. Yeah.
All right.
When my first attempt at those pickles, Hans, that would have caused
Toxic?
someone some issues. Yeah.
Oh no. Okay. All right.
But, you got to notice that.
That's a great public service announcement there.
PSA,
Smell the
don't eat anything.
fermentation. Yeah.
No matter what Hans tries to hand you, don't eat it.
That's just a good rule in general. Anyway, Paul, I would say watch Anthony Bourdain, No Reservations, Season 1, Episode 2, where he eats a Greenland shark. It's a very interesting one. And then I would say the YouTube algorithm, for some reason, has been like recommending me a lot of fermentation videos, which has been really interesting to see. There's a really funny one where this guy's YouTube channel called Golden Hive Mead makes mead out of like the most random
Mountain
products.
Dew.
Yeah, he has a Mountain Dew mead and he has a Monster Energy drink mead. So I thought that was pretty funny. So I was like, yeah, I like his channel. So that one's funny. Golden Hive Mead. But yeah, that's all the resources I have. So I think now is a good time to throw it over to our guest, Ryder Sadler, after the break. Welcome back, everyone. Joining us now, we have Ryder Sadler, Paul's friend. Ryder, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, Ryder. So just to begin, would you mind introducing yourself and what you're here to talk about today?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Long-time listener, first-time caller. My name's Ryder Sadler. Like you said, Paul and I were roommates for 2 years. Lovers for only a short portion of that.
Very nice.
And I'm here to talk about fermentation today. I gave Paul a long laundry list of things that I've briefly been interested in, and we decided on fermentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've done before, kind of some content that I like consuming, maybe some things you can try at home, and maybe lower the barriers to entry for some people, because it is pretty easy. It's hard to mess up sometimes.
Let me tell you, Hans, Ryder is definitely another hobby jumper. This
we
guy
love to see
will
it.
try
We
something
love to
new
see
every
it.
month.
That's why the list was so long, huh?
Yeah, there was a wide range of things that we could have talked about. So
all right, well, can't wait to have you on next week then. We'll talk about whatever's next.
Perfect. I can be a filler anytime you want. If you want the hobby of the week, just call me. Be like, we need a surprise guest. I've got 15 minutes on about any hobby that's out there. I've probably tried it at some point. So
amazing. So Ryder, before we start recording, you did say that you were coming in with notes for us. Can
yes.
we go ahead? Can we get that out of the way? Because
yeah,
I'm so
how can
curious.
we improve?
Just a couple notes. Improv episode was good. Paul did want to pretend that he didn't live in Durham for a good portion of the episode. It took a little while for him to be like, oh yeah, I guess I went to an improv show in Durham. I was like, this should have come up earlier. So Paul was trying to pretend like he didn't live in Durham. I didn't get name dropped either. I was the one who found the show and took us to it. So I was a little upset about that. I would have liked a little recognition.
He's talking about He's talking about
Middleditch and Schwartz. We watched that together. So he was like, "Oh yeah, I loved watching that." I was like, "Paul, I made you watch that." So I think you need to give credit to your influences. I think that would be important. This is a self-serving note as a side point. I think your improv games were good. I enjoyed those. What was my other note?
Is it all related to the improv episode?
Yes. It's the one I listened to this morning, so recency bias. And then Hans, you said you'd never been to a bad improv show. You haven't been to enough improv shows.
Okay.
As someone who, once again, a lot of hobbies, has taken improv classes and like done a show with like amateurs, they're objectively terrible. One time there was like a 65, 70-year-old woman in my improv class. And for like 5 minutes, like a full like sketch that I was in, she just cried like a baby the entire time because she thought that was funny. There was no context that introduced that topic. She just was like, "I'm a baby." 70-year-old woman. I'm like, "What are you doing? What do we?" There's no yes anding.
How
here.
can I work with this?
How can I work with this? Okay, so that was, you haven't been to enough improv shows if you haven't been to a bad one. You went to Second City, which is like supposed to be like the best improv that's available, like Second City or UCB. And I once again wanted to be name dropped because Paul went to a set that I did, separate hobby, stand up. And one of the sets of the competition, a guy made like a 4-minute set that was exclusively about the Virgin Mary being hot.
Oh, dude.
And it was the worst thing I've ever witnessed.
No.
And just,
this is like a friends and family show for like this first round of the competition, and he was getting booed.
Oh no.
So I agreed with that take, and I thought that was a hilarious story. So I was hoping Paul was going to mention that, and he didn't. So I just want to give the listeners more backstory on Paul's life. I know he likes to be an elusive, secretive man, but he has lived a lot of lives. So I think he should. We want some color, I want to hear about your personal experiences, Paul.
We'll do a whole episode, Ryder, and you can just come on and I'll talk about my life, and then you can give the commentary that I leave out.
Perfect. I'll just, if you need like 1 minute at the end of each show, just send me the pre-tape and I'll be like, all right, Paul didn't mention me here. He didn't talk about this here. It's Paul's
just
notes.
Comments about Ryder.
I'm actually going to make a podcast. It's just going to be this week I'm into. And it's just
the commentary podcast.
It's the commentary podcast on your podcast.
Can you do that with Sarah? Every time I start a recording, she's like, "Make sure you talk about this, this, and this," and then I inevitably forget all of it.
All right, Sarah and I are going to have the commentary podcast on your podcast.
I'd brilliant.
Love that. Thank you.
Okay, the official companion cast.
Perfect.
You have full IP. We grant that.
Yeah. Which. This may be a side note. Have you guys seen the Talk Tua podcast?
Yeah,
and then
the guys who drink wine.
Have you seen Talk Tua? And then there was a talking Talk Tua. And then she, rug pulled a meme coin and has disappeared off the face of the earth. But, so as long as you guys don't release a meme coin at the height of your popularity, I should have a long career as a companion podcaster. But
I don't know, Paul. What do you think? You into the crypto space these days?
I'll get my guy off of that.
Twee coin. This week I'm into coin. What do you think?
I think it's called Twisted Twee coin.
Twisted Twee. Brilliant. Well, Ryder, thank you for that input. That's first guest that comes in with notes. So episode 23, improv. We appreciate that. And, we're a growth mindset kind of podcast, so we'll take that to heart.
Perfect.
Brilliant. But anyway, let's get back on topic here. Ryder, you're here to talk about fermentation. Can you give us a little insight of how'd you originally get into fermentation and what's your current experience with it?
Yeah, so I mean, kind of like everybody, I had the COVID sitting in home making sourdough, which was making sourdough. I was like, okay, I want to get into this. I was in a cast iron moment. I was like, all right, I'm going to cook in my cast iron all the time and make sourdough bread. And I kept iterating. I'd make the first one. I was like, oh, my crumb isn't good. Or oh, I don't like the crust on this one. So I iterated. I was like, oh, the taste isn't great. And my roommates would eat it and they'd be like, oh, this is great. And after 3 months of making sourdough and like not liking any of it, I literally just discovered that I don't like sourdough bread. It wasn't like an iteration thing. I just don't like it. But that was kind of my introduction. And then
And so that led you to keep doing more?
Yeah, no, believe it or not. So it was a lot of college things. So sourdough, I eat like an enormous amount of yogurt. So like was like crushing Chobani in college. And then I was like, oh, I could probably do this. And was like, okay, how hard is it to make yogurt? Turns out yogurt's like the easiest fermentation project I could like suggest to anybody, like easier than sourdough. So like started making yogurt, wanted to make ginger beer, ultimately like made ginger beer when I lived with Paul. So like made a mess in our apartment. And then I wanted to make mead, but turns out honey's like, stupidly expensive. So I haven't made mead, but that's like on the bucket list. But got a couple books, but yeah, started with sourdough and then just like kind of did a bunch of other things. There was like I don't know if you guys ever watched Bon Appetit, but there was like the golden age of Bon Appetit YouTube. And there's a guy named Brad Leone who like had an It's Alive series. And he did like sourdough, kimchi, like fermented hot sauce, like all that type of stuff. And I really liked those videos. So that was probably kind of the beginning of it, was probably the YouTube videos a little bit, but kind of like sourdough and then YouTube videos kind of led me down the general path.
What are your current fermentation projects? What do you got going right now?
Yeah, so I made some ginger beer over the holidays. That was good. And I make yogurt pretty regularly because I eat it every week. Nice. So that one's pretty easy. I do that one pretty frequently. I want to do tepache, which is like a fermented pineapple drink. It's kind of like beer-esque. There's like different ways that you can do ferments. There's like wild ferments, which are like ferments that use the yeast that exists naturally on the like skin of a fruit or a vegetable or anything like that. So that's like ginger beer is one like that. Wine used to be like that, like historically wine, like it was the yeast on the skin of the grapes, but like we've obviously cultivated yeast at this point. So that's like wild yeast, like use what yeast is on the surface of the fruit or vegetable or whatever. But you can do like cultured. So tepache is typically like a wild ferment, but like champagne or anything like that, like you just go buy like cultured yeast. So like a very specific strain of bacteria that you would use. So it kind of like varies, but tepache is one that I want to do. It's a wild ferment. I want to do mead. I just like financially can't afford it. So I don't know what the residuals on this podcast are, but maybe it can fund my hobby. But
once you get your sister podcast up,
yeah, maybe that'll carry me through. So I want to do mead. I think that'd be good, like a little honey wine. That one you use like a cultured yeast as well, like you buy a champagne yeast or like a wine yeast. I want to do kefir, which is like I don't know if you guys are big kombucha fans, but like there's like scobies, which is a symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast, and it's like the little mold, like jelly that like sits in kombucha. If you buy like a kombucha, sometimes there's one in there called the mother, if you want to be weird about it. But kefir is like a yogurt drink that basically has like little scobies that you put in it, but you have to buy it off the internet. And I like am so sketched out by buying like black market kefir scobies that I'm just like afraid I'm gonna get murdered or like die.
That's
from the
fair.
quality of them. You'd feel more comfortable just picking up one in like a Walmart parking lot.
Well, no, it's like you are like, okay, I want to buy a SCOBY for kefir. Like they're called kefir grains. And I'm like, okay, where do I get kefir grains? And it's like, oh, I'm buying it from like, Flowers and Petals on Etsy. And I'm like, I don't know who this is. And like, they could be selling me like tire rubber for all I know. Like,
I think that's the same website that Hans gets his fun facts from.
That's right. I mean, you don't really know the quality control coming off Etsy, right? Like anyone could really put anything on Etsy. So
yeah, and I've gotten scammed by Etsy before, so I'm like I once tried to buy like seeds to grow stuff, and I'm 90% sure they just sent me hay. They were like, "Yeah, no, this is what it looks like," and I was like, "Nothing ever grew." I was like, "This was a waste of $20." So
that's funny.
What can you do? The customer complaint is not. Like customer complaint website isn't very robust for Etsy. So
God, I wouldn't think it would be.
No. Yeah. So it happens, but want to do kefir. Yeah, just to, maybe get your listeners into fermentation. I recognize it's sketchy to be like, I need to leave milk out on my counter overnight, but that's like what it is. It's totally fine.
So, okay, wait. So Ryder, walk us through like a simple fermentation.
Sure.
Let's go with yogurt because you're doing it all the time, right?
Yeah.
Something that seems like you can't mess up. I've seen you do it. It looks really easy.
Yeah.
How does it work?
Yeah, so easy. So you literally just buy milk, preferably pasteurized. This isn't a raw milk podcast, right? You guys haven't had Joe Rogan on yet?
I've always wanted to try it, but I agree.
I don't think we can advocate for raw milk, Paul. I think that's...
So like you get milk, you heat it up to 185. So technically you're like repasteurizing it, but like you don't want like the stuff in your environment to mess it up. So you heat up a gallon of milk in I use like a crock pot, or not a crock pot, a Dutch oven. So I use a Dutch oven, heat it up to 185, like stirring it as you go. Once it hits 185, you just turn it off. You let it cool to 115. You need to add some like starter yogurt in. So just like a scoop of yogurt you have, or like you buy like the little cup at the store. Use whichever yogurt you like because you want that strain of bacteria, because it'll actually like, as it ferments, you'll end up with a similar flavor profile and like tanginess as whatever one you have. So up to 185, down to 115, stir in your yogurt. Put the Dutch oven, like wrap it up in some towels, or I have like a cooler. I put it in the cooler and you like literally let it set overnight. That's it. When you wake up the next morning, you will have yogurt. It's really all it is. So you repasteurize it by taking it up to 185. You have to cool it down back to 115 before you add your starter yogurt. Otherwise you would kill the yogurt bacteria that you're trying to like inoculate the yogurt with. And then you just need to let it ferment, but you want to maintain it at like a warm temperature to kind of facilitate that fermentation. Depending on who you ask, you're like supposed to keep it at 110, and you can buy yogurt makers that like will keep it at 110, or like I think Instant Pots have a yogurt setting. I just don't have an Instant Pot. So I like wrap it up in towels and put it in a cooler. And then in the morning you have yogurt. It will be, if you're like a Greek yogurt fan like I am, you'd need to add in straining it. So you would have to strain it as well. To remove some of the whey and just make it thicker, because that's all Greek yogurt is strained yogurt. But that's it. So it's really just like heat it up, cool it down, add in some like starter yogurt, and then wait, and you'll have yogurt. General rule of thumb: if it smells bad, don't eat it. But it'll be fine.
Don't fermenting things kind of in general sometimes smell bad? Like, how do you know if it's just a fermentation smell versus a it's gone bad smell?
So you'll know.
You'll know.
It's one of those things where it's like we've evolved pretty well as humans to like know when something's spoiled, and like obviously there's like botulism risk with like anything, but that's like a very specific situation. And botulism, like don't quote me on this one, but like the way fermentation works is like it generates a lot of like lactic acid and other things that actually like would suppress botulism in a lot of cases. So it's like a very specific set of scenarios that would allow botulism to happen. But also like, you'll know, like it smells really bad if something's gone wrong. Whereas like a little yeasty or like a little sour is like kind of inherently part of it. And then just like, taste a little bit. And if it tastes terrible, don't eat it and throw it out. But like yogurt, I don't know that I've never had it like go bad. I just have had it like not set up well. Like I just didn't have the right temperature range, and it didn't inoculate, or like the strain that I was using wasn't strong enough. If you reuse the same yogurt as an inoculation, it will kind of weaken over time, and you like need to get like a new inoculating batch from the store. But generally with yogurt, you'll like know if it hasn't done what it's supposed to, because it will set up and it'll look like yogurt, it'll taste like yogurt, it'll smell like yogurt. So if it seems bad, it probably is bad, and don't risk it.
So do you notice an improvement in quality when you're making your own yogurt, or what's your motive behind making the yogurt?
I don't really know.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
I can make a lot of it.
Like,
yeah, I mean, it's like kind of nice to like be like, I make my own yogurt. You feel a little crunchy, but that's not so bad. Yeah, I don't know. I think I was just like eating a lot of it. So I was just going through it a lot. And I was like, I could probably make this myself. It is a question of, is it worth your time? Because yogurt's just not that expensive. But I mean, it's enjoyable. I can make I mean, like a gallon of yogurt's kind of a lot, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. And yogurt is inherently cheaper than yogurt because it's like a value added product. But I'm spending an hour probably working on it in total, and it takes 12 hours to ferment. So it's like I'm kind of watching it. Takes a little while. You're using a lot of electricity, so it's like,
Okay.
Am I saving
Yeah.
money? I don't know. But is it nice to make your own yogurt? It's kind of like a fun
Yeah.
thing to do. Experience it.
Do you have a favorite inoculating yogurt?
Yeah, so the best option is a blend of Noosa yogurt and skyr.
That's new to me.
Yeah, so Noosa yogurt is like a Greek yogurt, and it's got the like strains of bacteria or whatever that was like kind of typical with the Greek yogurt. And then skyr is from a different region. So like when you think about like yogurt being the flora and fauna of a certain region, the strains are a little bit different, and like the tanginess that you're going to get and all that type of stuff. So I discovered that if I did some Noosa and some skyr, I liked the blend.
You're a sommelier of yogurt at this point.
I think so.
I've eaten a lot of yogurt.
Ryder, what are you able to change in your fermentations, and like how has that been, like how can you like notice the effects of different criteria that you've messed with?
Yeah, so yogurt's pretty standard. You can change what you're fermenting or like what your inoculation is, and that'll be like kind of change your texture a little bit or kind of how sour it is or sweet it is. But you can change, if I used whole milk versus 2%, it'd be different, and you kind of would be able to taste that. But the one that you probably have witnessed the most was kind of my tweaks with ginger beer. And I think that's true with kind of fermenting alcohol and fermenting things like that. There's a lot more variables that you can change. Yogurt is just fermented milk, but ginger beer that I was making was you can edit kind of sugar content. You can edit how much acid you add. You can add other things in it. We did the kind of cinnamony star anise cloves batch for Christmas last year. That was good. And that actually introduced some other wild yeast that were on the skin of the cinnamon and caused it to explode a little bit, but that's okay.
That was cool.
So really with fermenting kind of alcohols and ginger beer and stuff, because you're carbonating a liquid and you're producing ethanol in kind of higher quantities. So fermentation broadly is converting glucose or some kind of equivalent into CO2 and ethanol. And with making ginger beer is interesting because I would do a bulk ferment. So ferment with its ability to off gas. So I'm not carbonating it. I'm kind of letting the CO2 off, but am converting the sugars into ethanol. And then I would bottle it. And then that way you're kind of carbonating it. And I found I could vary how long I bulk fermented in like a big glass carboy before I bottled it. How I varied how long I bulk fermented kind of would change how strong it was, kind of how carbonated it was. Because once you bottle it, it kind of slows down how much fermentation is happening because it's not able to off gas, and it kind of changes a little bit. So it was interesting to kind of tweak with how much sugar I added, if I added sugar after the bulk ferment. So there's a lot of things that I could tweak, and kind of when I added sugar, if I held off on adding sugar, tweaking what other things I added in. So adding in spices and stuff kind of introduced other yeast that kind of gave it an interesting twist. What else did I do? If you add too much acid, it sometimes just won't ferment at all because you've actually introduced an environment where the lactic acid can't or the bacteria can't overcome the amount of acid you've added. So I had to be careful about how much like lemon juice you add to the initial bulk product. So you can tweak a lot of things. It is kind of subject to your environment. I have a book that I've brought as well. The Art of Fermentation. It's hefty. And he kind of gets into kind of how many things can be impacted by your environment. So like, if you live in the north, it gets cold in the winter, and that might change your ferments and how it works. So kind of your environment's pretty important, just because, ambient temperatures are going to change. Fermentation's pretty temperature specific for a lot of things. Certain yeasts can operate outside a certain window, but like a very specific window that you kind of have to maintain them in. And that's kind of one challenge of fermenting, I would say, is just kind of balancing that. So kind of environment's pretty important. And then just kind of like, what are your inputs and how can you vary them? So it's kind of interesting. And with like sourdough, your protein content in the wheat will impact it. How much sugar is in the wheat is kind of important. How much water you add, the hydration ratio. So it's a lot about inputs. It's a little bit about environment. If you're doing like wild ferments, so kind of what I talked about with ginger beer or tepache, if you buy vegetables that are like not organic, they either have a pesticide in them that have killed all those yeast, or they've been like irradiated, so shot with radiation to kill all that type of stuff. So you have to it's interesting kind of how you've procured your ingredients is interesting. By far the best ginger beer batch I made was the ginger that I grew outside our apartment. So I grew ginger from scratch. Also very easy. If we want to get into, horticulture or gardening as a different hobby, we can talk about that too. I grew a lot of plants at Paul's apartment. So growing it myself was interesting because you kind of end up with all of those yeasts and things on the skin just because you haven't irradiated it or sprayed pesticides or anything on it. So that was interesting. That's probably the best batch of ginger beer that I had, was the one that I had grown the ginger myself. And that was what we had for the cookie party number 2. That ginger beer was made with the ginger I grew.
It's another note that I haven't mentioned, the cookie party. Sorry about that. It's pretty interesting, right? That the amount of things that affect, because especially with sourdough, and I'm thinking about baking, a lot of baking that I've tried to do, right, is very formulaic. Like you really need to know like your inputs like by weight, right? It's not just kind of like a feel thing like a lot of cooking is. And I mean, maybe you've experienced this, Ryder, with either sourdough or other kinds of fermentation, but like you're saying, like very little changes can like drastically affect like the outcome of your dough or just like the way it feels. Which is funny when you watch people who like those old dudes in New York who like work at a bagel store. They're like, oh, I've just been doing this for 30 years. If it's a little cold outside, like I feel it, and I don't need to weigh anything.
And they're using like an old ricotta container to like measure out their ingredients. They're like, yeah, it's 3 ricotta containers of flour, and you're like, that's not a metric amount. Like, what does that mean? No, I definitely agree with you. And it's kind of weird. Another weird thing is like kind of how things choose and like to ferment, like just how bacteria like choose to work. Because like you would think with like yogurt, for example, if I had a gallon of yogurt, I'd actually only inoculate it with like 2 tablespoons of yogurt. Like it's a very small amount of input as the inoculation. And that's like the suggested amount, is like you use a pretty small amount and allow it to inoculate. It's weird that if you add like a lot of your inoculation base, it actually won't work. So it's kind of like one of those weird things where it's like you sometimes think like, more is better, but sometimes less is more. And it's kind of one of those weird situations where like you don't want to over inoculate. So there's some interesting tweaks like that. Like I agree.
Ryder, I heard you talk about explosions a little bit. Can you dive into a little bit about like what happens when fermentation goes wrong?
Yeah, so you like traditionally are supposed to burp your bottles when you're fermenting because you don't want it to over pressurize. But sometimes you forget to do that and you have an overactive ferment, or you just haven't checked on it for recently enough. So I've had some overactive ones, and you just like, you open the top and it just like shoots out and you're like, oh fuck, I've made a giant mess. Luckily I haven't had any like glass explosions. I did almost risk one. I was like in the middle of a ferment and I noticed I had like a crack in one of my bottles, and I was like, ooh, glad I saw that. Because like that's pretty risky. And you're putting a decent amount of pressure on these bottles. So you have to buy like very specific. There's like a homebrew store in Durham that I went to go get them from because I was like, I don't want to like cause an explosion. And just like typical like bubbling over, anything that's like over, and that's one thing that's like tough to judge, is how active your ferment's going to be, because sometimes there's plenty of ginger beer I make that just like would never ferment and there's nothing I could do about it. And then sometimes you can use the same ginger bug a week later and like some yeast from the environment has fallen in, and all of a sudden now it's like the most active ferment you've ever had. So it's one of those things where it's like you do have to like feel it out a little bit. I know we just talked about like not feeling things out, but it's like you kind of have to like, check in on your baby and make sure that it isn't going to like, murder you in your sleep because you've created a pipe bomb in your apartment. So I would always like, have it in a crate and then like put a towel over it. So if it did explode, at least it would be like a contained explosion for the most part, but never killed Paul and I. So we survived.
It is one of those things where he's like, oh, you want to try this one? It's like, well, yeah, but am I going to be safe? So you make sure he tries it first.
Yeah, no, I would always like my ginger beer, like anything, I'd like have it the day before I was going to feed it to somebody else, because like, all right, if I'm going to hospitalize myself, it should happen within 24 hours. Like, no, and I like had that conversation with the guy at the homebrew store. I was like, all right, I'm making this. Like, what can I do to check? I'm not trying to kill my friends. He was like, dude, chill out. You're not going to kill your friends. Like, it's fine. So that's kind of where I like, it's not a lackadaisical, but it's just kind of like the process of fermentation has been going on for like thousands and thousands of years as like a means of preservation. And like, maybe people just died in the past. I don't know. But like people have done it in like very informal like ways for a long time. And like that's what yogurt like was just like a way to preserve milk in like very warm climates. So like, you know, it'll be fine. But no, I normally was a taste tester before I give it to anybody else. But I had situations where I was like, I'm going to taste this one before I give it to somebody else. Like, because I had a couple ginger beers that were just like very yeasty. And you're like never sure if that's because something's gone wrong and like there's a rogue bacteria, or if it's just because like, you know, this one happened to be a little more brewy.
Okay, so my question is, just because you seem a lot of what's gone bad, what is an okay taste. You say that sometimes it tastes yeasty. What does it mean to taste yeasty? Like, can you describe that to me?
Yeah, I can try. Actually, I don't know that I mean, it's like kind of like beer, like beery, kind of like a beer, the smell of like bread dough is probably the best. Like uncooked bread dough is like what I would categorize as yeasty. And that's kind of why ginger beer is called ginger beer, is because like pretty often you'll end up with this like beer-esque yeasty smell. And it's because it's like a similar fermentation process to how beer works. Beer obviously like has hops and like a very specific yeast strain to generate like beer. But I think that's kind of why it's called ginger beer, is like if you let it ferment long enough, you'll get kind of a beery alcohol level. Eventually it'll turn into vinegar. It's kind of like the end result of fermentation if you let it go too long, is like you go product to an alcoholized product, and then like as the alcohol breaks down it becomes vinegar. But yeah, I think it's just kind of unbaked bread, I think is my best
I think that's a good description,
I guess.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was like, describe to me the color blue.
Yeah.
Can't really do that. So
Did you ever check the alcohol content on some of your ginger beers?
Yeah, so the one I made this year, I bought the little thing, which, by the way, if anyone makes ginger beer and then tries to measure the alcohol content, you have to measure it before and after. Can't just measure after, turns out. So I had like
good tips.
I made a batch and was like, oh, I'm going to measure the alcohol content of this one. And then like I went and bought $30 worth of equipment to like measure it. And it's like this little like glass thing, and you have to like suspend it in the solution. And then I like read the instructions like, all right, measure before and after. And I was like, well, before already happened, so nothing I can do there. But I measured it this year, and I think it was like 0.8%. So it was like very similar to kombucha. It's like pretty low, but like there's some in it. And I think it's just because it's like a wild ferment is like not the most efficient in producing like alcohol and kind of taking advantage of all the nutrients, which is like why a lot of people will go buy like cultured strains, just because like it has a known performance. And like with yeast cultures that you buy from a home brewing store or anything, like they will say like this will be X percentage alcohol. And just with ginger that I grew out of the ground, it's kind of hard to say what the alcohol percentage is, not advertised. So I think it's probably around 1% is probably on average. Like I might have more. This one was like not the most active ferment I had. So yeah, 0.8 probably is like the lower end of the spectrum, whereas like 1 is probably standard. I think you can get them higher, but I think it's like you have to like intentionally culture over time, like a more alcohol-esque set of bacteria. So
you're trying to be able to share it at a family function, so I don't think that's the goal.
My dad's a big fan, so I've given it to him before, and he's like, "There's alcohol in this?" I was like, a little bit. Calm down.
I was wondering, pivoting a little bit to sourdough. I know you came in with possibly a story about working with a more historical starter. Like,
can
you dive a little bit into that?
Yeah. So I went to UVA undergrad and was an engineer, and in my class was someone whose parents had immigrated from Italy. And when they immigrated, they brought this like 150, 175-year-old sourdough starter that had like been in this girl's family from Italy. And it was like important enough to the family that they brought it over when they immigrated to the US. And sourdough starter, you like kind of feed it over time, and it's like a very like active process to keep one alive. And she knew I was making sourdough. We were friends. And she was like, oh, like next time I like have to feed it and like kind of change it out, like I'll give you some of this very historic, bacteria from Italy. Allegedly, some people claim that the bacteria is just like cycle and it's really more environmental, but it's cooler to say it's a 200-year-old sourdough starter.
There's probably a little bit from there, right?
It's probably a little bit, and like it probably has some influence, and there's probably something like that. But yeah, 200-year-old starter from Italy, generational sourdough starter. She gave it to me. I made like a loaf of bread. Like it was great. It worked awesome. And then I don't remember what happened. I think it got like pushed to the back of a nasty college fridge. And I like forgot about it because I just like wasn't making bread. And I like pulled it out and it was like completely dried out, completely dead. And I was like, shit.
Oh, no.
I can't believe I murdered this like girl's, heirloom sourdough starter due to neglect. I never told her. So Ariana, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm very sorry. But no, definitely just like was like, this is the kindest thing anyone's ever given me. This is like a family heirloom, and I murdered it. So it happens.
That's tough.
Yeah.
I find keeping sourdough starter alive really challenging because, and maybe you have some tips for this, Ryder, but when I was in my sourdough phase, right, you're like, you feed it like every few days or, every day if you leave it out. Like one of my issues is like, what do you do with all the byproduct, right? Because like I can't make bread every day. Like I don't eat that much bread. There's only so many like scrap recipes or whatever they call it. And then I just feel like I'm using so much flour, and like good flour is kind of expensive.
Yeah, that was my other like qualm with is I just felt so wasteful because like I also didn't want to eat 17 sourdough scrap pancakes. Like it's just I didn't like sourdough. So it was just a wasteful process. Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen more stuff recently on kind of ways to use it, like on TikTok. Like people have used it as like a thickening agent in soups or pastas, or like just because I mean it's a starchy water and flour mixture, which is pretty common for like as a thickening agent. So I've seen it used that way, but like I similarly like just was like, I'm wasting so much. And I was putting it down my drain, which is apparently terrible because it'll harden. So sorry to the Venable Apartments. You might have had to replace the pipes. Statute of limitations is passed.
I definitely was doing the
All right,
same
you're safe.
thing.
All right. Well, okay, so Ryder, this podcast, right, it's about jumping into a new hobby, new passion every week. So what's kind of the elevator pitch for why should someone pick up fermentation?
Yeah, I mean, it's good for you. Like, I think there's been a rise in like desire for probiotic health, and almost all fermentations like have probiotics in them. Like that's part of the premise, is like kind of improving your gut health. So if anyone cares about their gut health, and wants to start making more food at home, I think it is a really interesting hobby. It's cool to say that you like made yogurt or made ginger beer. Brings you close together. I mean, we had a party and I got to serve people my ginger beer. That was always nice. And like, it's also like a very fun, can be inexpensive hobby. Like if you're making yogurt, it's a very low lift. And I think it's kind of cool to see the payoff and maybe be a little less scared of food. I think that's kind of maybe one of my crunchiest takes is like we've maybe like over sanitized our food system in certain areas, and I like it clean in other places. I worked for a food manufacturer for a brief period, but like also like, you can leave milk out overnight if you're making yogurt and like it doesn't kill you. Don't drink raw milk. Let me be clear. Let me back
Yeah.
up. I said we'd over sanitize, but I don't mean drink raw milk. I mean like try a fermented food. Like, Paul would have like kind of crazy things he'd cook and I'd like to try it. So I think it's more like less over sanitized, more so like a lot of cultures have done stuff in ways that are different than how US has like traditionally eaten and consumed food. So like, expand your boundaries. I think yogurt is like the easiest intro that I could ever prescribe, which is heat it up to 185. That pasteurizes it. So like you don't need to worry about it. Let it cool down. inoculate it, wrap it up in a towel, put it in a cooler. If you have an Instant Pot, there's literally a yogurt button, so you don't have to do anything. Next morning, you'll have yogurt. It's like a very cool transformation, and it tastes pretty good. So that would be my pitch: is expand your horizons, try new things.
Yeah.
I think it's a fun science project too.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that it's gotten popular enough where Instant Pot has a yogurt button. I mean, I think that means it's hit the mainstream. So there you go. Give it a try.
Yeah. Fun terms I'd like to throw out there: backslopping. I put that in my notes.
Okay.
Dude.
Just wanted to put that out there. There's some fun terms in fermentation.
No explanation. You're not going to tell us what it means?
I know. Google it. No. So backslopping is like your last batch, inoculating your next batch with it. So like back slopping, like you're like backward slopping your inoculation.
It's like home Ryder sloppy seconds.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that. You get what I'm saying. Backslopping was a fun one. Anaerobic, if we're hip. I like saying flora and fauna. What else? I think that's it. That's all I got on fun terms.
Is yeast flora or fauna, or is it what's the classification there?
I think it's technically a fauna. Like yeast are alive. Like they're bacteria.
No, flora are plants.
What'd I say? Fauna?
You said alive. It's not that it's alive or dead. It's like it's whether it's a plant or not, right? I would assume flora relates to plants.
It's a good point.
It's not a plant.
It's a fauna.
But I mean, don't you think like yeast is closer to animal cell than it is to a plant cell?
That's exactly. That's why I think it's a fauna.
Oh, that's your point. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
You have to have a biologist on next week to teach everybody about
Hans
flora
is a
and
biologist.
fauna. What?
That's what doesn't
Hans
matter.
is a biologist.
If you know the answer, email thisweekiminto@gmail.com. Awesome. Ryder, do you have any plugs, either personal or any pieces of media you want to give a shout out to?
I don't think so. I like this. This book is interesting. He's like definitely crunchy.
Who's the book by?
Sandor Katz. So plug for the book. It is a good book. It's got like anything you could ever want to ferment, the basics, all sorts of stuff.
What's like the craziest thing you've considered doing?
I mean, there's like a lot of things with like mold that I'm not willing to do. Cause like koji and like tempeh or like fermenting tofu or like soybeans to make like soy sauce seems beyond my capabilities, which I'll plug a different guy. There's a guy on TikTok. I'm going to butcher his name, but his name's Johnny Kyungho, but he does like a ton of ferments. So he's done soy sauce, he's done miso, kimchi, like all those types of things. His are really interesting and like very approachable and like kind of how he does it. So that's good. I'm just not willing to like intentionally grow mold. Like that seems like I need to like.
That's the next level.
Yeah, I'm not
on fridge for that. You can't be putting that with the rest of your food.
Yeah, you've got to like have an isolated area to like do that in that you're willing to like, sanitize. So not quite willing to do that. Yeah, so mold I'm not willing to do. I would like to do like, I think mead would be interesting. I do need more equipment to do mead. That's the other thing is like, this can be a very cheap hobby. It can also become a very expensive hobby very quickly. Just like buying glassware that can be pressurized, buying, bottling equipment, corks and all sorts of stuff. So, I think it's nice. It's approachable to like make yogurt and like making kimchi. I don't think is incredibly difficult. I'd like to do that. The one problem is normally like, if you're doing it, you're like, okay, I need to make enough that like this is worth it. And then that's how you end up with a gallon of yogurt. And you're like, what the fuck am I going to do with a gallon of yogurt?
How am I going to eat a gallon of yogurt?
Well, that's what I do with the ginger beer.
Like yogurt.
Yeah, I'd make a gallon of ginger beer. And I'm like, what am I going to, I couldn't drink a gallon of ginger beer if I wanted. Like, this is crazy. Yeah, so I hope everybody ferments. Reach out to me, Ryder Sadler, if you want to try something. I'll give you any tips.
That's amazing. Awesome. Ryder, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. Best of luck in your next fermentation project. And, we might even have Paul send you some honey as a thank you to get you started on the mead.
Does it have to be non Like store honey? Does it need to be like natural honey?
No, because mead you're doing with like I'd go buy a champagne yeast or something. But no, you don't need to go buy me honey.
Okay.
Just give me some sugar next time I see you, Paul.
Single source. I'll
Nice.
give you some sugar.
Awesome. Ryder, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. I'll be back with notes next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the This Week I'm Into podcast, and a huge thank you to Ryder Sadler for sharing his passion on fermentation. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, please reach out at thisweekiminto@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram at thisweekiminto. Please rate us 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. We're doing our best to grow the podcast, and your help really goes a long way. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Man, this environment is so much better than being in the dirt. Look, we can see everywhere from this bottle, from one side of this guy's counter to the other.
I know, he even put a blanket over our heads. It's just so cozy, and look at all this sugar. It's everywhere.
Hans, this is incredible. We've hit the jackpot. So much delicious glucose. I can barely keep up.
Eat faster. The more we eat, the more we multiply. We're gonna be kings of fermentation.
Don't mind me. My mitochondria is going to be working overtime tonight.
What a wonderful powerhouse of the cell.
Oh, I think I overdid it. My cell walls feel like it's going to burst.
Excuse me. Wait, did you just feel that?
Whoa, what was that? Someone patting me on the back?
I think someone just burped us.
Well, that was nice. I felt so much better. Oh no.
What's happening?
The gas, it's building up again. It's nonstop.
Paul, it's getting tight in here. Too much CO2.
I can't breathe.
Oh, remind me never to binge on sugar again.
Deal, but after a little nap.